Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for Clear Up the Chaos Power Hour in September. We're super excited. Some of you I know attended our first one last month, and it's great to see you back. And then I am seeing quite a few new attendees as well, so we're thrilled to have you. A few housekeeping things, if you would go ahead, if you haven't already muted your microphone, if you would go ahead and mute your microphone. And just a friendly reminder, you can send your questions in via the chat box. And so that's a great opportunity for you to funnel those questions to myself, and I can get those communicated over to Michelle for her to address before our session is over. So with that being said, I want to respect everyone's time and go ahead and begin on time. If you haven't met Michelle at any of our in-person seminars, this is Michelle McCarter. She's with Blakeman and Associates, and we also last week had a really successful virtual seminar that went really well that she helped us put on. So Michelle, I am going to kind of turn things over to you, and we're going to kind of kickstart things with open enrollment meetings and Zoom and what that looks like, because I know open enrollments are going to be looking different this year, and kind of your guidance and advice on things that employers need to consider in regards to FLSA and safeguarding that private information that comes along with those open enrollments. Oh, Michelle, you're still muted, I think.
Oh, good morning. Is that better?
Yes.
Good morning. Don't you love technology? So Zoom meetings are, of course, part of our new norm here. And as we get closer to the end of the year, we're looking at open enrollment. Some companies, I know, still aren't allowing employees back in the workplace. Some have even said not before the first of the year. So when that is the case, we have to look at open enrollment meetings and what can we do as an employer when we're trying to manage all of this remotely. So we have a couple of things to consider. You know, I mean, this is not going to impact every workforce the same way, but we're going to cover that. And then feel free to message Elizabeth any questions that you might have. So with the open enrollment meetings, there are some rules under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That is the law that defines the classification of exempt and non-exempt, and if somebody, which technically means if they're overtime eligible, and if you have to track their hours for pay. So hopefully everybody that has been allowing remote work from employees already knows which employees they have to track time on and have a mechanism for tracking accurate time worked. So meetings, the reason this is important to meetings is because meetings are considered work time generally if they're work related, but there's 4 criteria that must be met for a meeting not to be considered work time. So if a meeting is work time, all of the time spent at the meeting has to be paid. So if you are an hourly person, meaning you're not an exempt employee under the FLSA, then you have to be paid for that time, which, you know, if you're having a meeting about insurance and their benefits, you might say, well, that's for their benefit. It's not actually productive work that they're doing. And that's a good point. But all 4 criteria need to be met. So the first criteria is that attendance needs to be outside their regular working hours. So if you do it during the normal work day, you should plan to just pay for that time. Attendance also needs to be voluntary. So if you are requiring them to attend an open enrollment Zoom meeting, then you would have to pay them. Also, it needs to be not directly related to their job. So if, you know, their insurance is not something that is directly related to their job, although it benefits them, and it would be not productive work during that time. So those are the 4 criteria. Outside of the regular hours, non-productive work, voluntary, and not directly related to their job. So a Zoom open enrollment meeting has 2 of the 4 criteria. So since it doesn't have all 4 criteria, time spent during that meeting would need to be paid. If you're going to have a Zoom meeting and you're going to be sending open enrollment forms over the internet or housing them on your server, you really need to think about security. Maybe you have a Dropbox that's a more secure way to send information, because you're gathering date of birth, social security number, private medical information sometimes on some of those enrollment forms. So you need to pay attention to that too, and that responsibility that you have as the employer to safeguard that information. That's the bulk of addressing that topic. I do want to spend just a brief minute on, whether or not a meeting is considered work time. So one of the things that I get asked on a regular basis is if somebody wants to go back to school or do a class that would help with their growth, and my company has a educational reimbursement credit. So that would be an example of where it wouldn't have to be paid because it is voluntary, it's their choice. So if it's completely the employee's choice, just because the employer has a benefit and pays for it, doesn't mean the time spent in that class is work time. It's not productive work because they're furthering their education, not doing the workload at their desk or in their job. It is related, it could be related to the job, but as I said, that's a special circumstance, and typically attendance is done outside of work hours. So just want to throw that in there as well. We are seeing a combination of people working remotely and working on site. It is okay if you are allowing an employee to work remotely because of childcare reasons, or maybe they were exposed and they are asymptomatic. Depending upon the industry that you're in, whether you're an essential industry or not, you could have an asymptomatic employee come in for a meeting, or you could hold a couple of different meetings. And so those are some options. If you allowed an employee to work remotely, or you allowed them to get time off, whether it's under any of the laws that apply or you're just working with them under a company leave program, you can contact them while they're off and have them come in for this meeting. It's you're perfectly within your rights to ask them to make that exception, and then of course you would pay them for that time. I can't hear you.
We're having the same issues. So thank you for that information. I haven't received any questions on that, but I know some may continue to funnel through, but we'll go ahead and move to the next topic. Can you speak to the different challenges associated with holding staff accountable, being remote, and maintaining that positive company culture while still feeling connected to staff?
Sure. I'm going to break that into two parts. The first thing is holding employees accountable as they work remotely. A lot of employers were just thrown a curveball, jobs that they wouldn't normally consider for telework. Now they're having to do that for business operations and to reduce the spread of COVID. So we're scrambling in a way to kind of keep up with what are our rules and what does work. So you might try a couple different things and determine what works. And it's perfectly fine for you to communicate and be transparent. In fact, it's recommended with the employees. This is new for us. We're going to try a few different things, but let's talk about your workload and what can be done remotely, or maybe is there an option for part remote and part in the office. So maybe you come in once a week. Maybe the staff could take alternate days to come in once a week, but just speaking openly about how can we accommodate what you need as the employee, reducing the spread of COVID and yet still get the work done. So once we decide we're going to have that work remotely, we need to communicate on the front end what we expect from the employees. So if we expect, a good morning email when you log on to the system, and either being copied on emails or sending over your to-do list for the day, and then a checkout email at the end of the day where you update your employer on what you've done for that day. It could be done on a daily basis. It could be done on a weekly basis. You could be copied on all the emails that go through, but you really need to think about what's a good way for the supervisors to not have to manage the work so much. So if you're copied on every email, then that could just increase the supervisor's job instead of just, managing the workflow. So it could be a weekly email, it could be a daily email, it could be 2 emails a day. You could be logging, if you're in the customer service industry, you could be logging on like a CRM or something like that, what your communication is with your clients. And that way your employer can run that log. It's also a good idea to, you're still an employee, you're still the employer, but sometimes when we work remotely, we forget. And, if we were in the office, we'd just go across the hall and address it. Well, nothing prevents you from sending an email and having a conversation, or picking up the phone and having a conversation. Sometimes we forget the importance of that interaction. Email and text are nice, but they're not really a substitute for a conversation. We need to think about the communications that we need to have and whether they're better suited for a phone call or even, a Zoom meeting or something like that. But we don't want to be meeting to death either, because we want the time to be productive when we're working remotely. So that's the general guidance on just working remotely. The other part of it is staying connected. And part of that is just remembering to pick up the phone. Or, you, the employer that might be in the office, just picking up the phone and calling the employee. If they have scheduled Zoom calls with clients or scheduled phone calls with clients, maybe that could be on a shared calendar so you don't call them during that time. But just staying in touch and having those conversations. It doesn't have to be or feel like you're micromanaging. It could just be a natural, I want to see how you're doing and check in on your day, or it could be more work related. Where are you on these things? But the other thing that we're missing when we're working remotely is how your team just kind of communicates together, and the synergies that are created by communicating together. So if you would have like a brainstorm meeting for a marketing meeting, you could do that through Zoom. You could also do fun things through Zoom, whether it's, bingo or something like that, or, introducing your kids or your pet or something through Zoom. Just not forgetting to take that personal relationship, just extension to the working remotely. So you should still celebrate birthdays. If you celebrate birthdays, you could, I could have a cupcake and say happy birthday and send it out on a Zoom meeting. Just trying to take that extra step so that people still feel included. If you normally do Monday morning stand-up meetings, trying to do that over Zoom, or shooting out interesting things to read in email, or maybe having a competition, getting your team involved to where you have a competition for how many sales calls each of you can make in a day. And maybe it's a reward with a gift card or something like that. There's a lot of different things you can do, but just putting some thought and effort into how can I make this fun? How can I help the team still feel connected during this time? But when we're out of sight, we tend to be out of mind, and we don't want to do that, because then when employees get reintroduced back into the workforce, it feels awkward or forced, and we want that to be seamless. And, in some ways, employees have said that they're more productive working remotely. So as an employer, you may need to consider what works for your environment. So that's my suggestion on that topic.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. I have received a question going back to being paid to attend some trainings and or meetings. Regarding being paid to attend meetings, employees are working remote, but the employer is holding a meeting that all are required to attend in person. Employee A has a 45-minute commute one way and has requested to attend virtually and been denied. Is the employer required to pay travel time for the employee?
So travel time is also governed by the FLSA. They define what is work time. And travel is one of those things. So travel as part of your job, where you check in at one location and go to another throughout the day, like an HVAC technician, that all that travel is work time. But if it's a commute, 45 minutes, and they would normally work at that office, then that is not compensable time. If their normal commute to and from work is 10 minutes and you're asking everybody to come to a different location, I don't think 45 minutes is too much, but if it takes, hours or something like that, it's not a set definition of distance, but we could fall under a special out-of-town assignment when we get too far. And then we look at it being compensable as it cuts across the workday. So if it's the normal office where they would be required to come to work and they just are working remotely and it's a mandatory meeting, then you can require them to come in. You don't have to pay them for that normal commute. And if they refuse, you can hold them accountable to your company policies. For example, refusing a reasonable request is insubordination. Some employers skip progressive discipline steps for insubordination. They consider that pretty serious. But also consider what's going on in the employee's life. Is the employee working remotely because their child is sick, or because their child doesn't have a choice and has to do in-person or has to do remote school? Things like that. So you do have to consider those things. You can ask them to make special arrangements, especially if you're working with them on the other schedule, and you can hold them accountable. If you're having everybody come into a corporate office and it would be a couple hours, it'd be considered an out-of-town assignment, then I would think that that would be compensable because it would fall under the out-of-town special assignment, one-day assignment under the travel rules under FLSA. Hope that answers the question. If not, you can shoot us an email or keep texting or typing.
Thank you so much. Keep those questions coming just as a reminder in the chat box. Michelle, can you speak to return to work strategies?
Sure. So return to work strategies we're hearing a lot more of this. Some companies said our bottom line is October 1st and we need people back in the office regardless of what COVID-related concerns they may have. So I mentioned earlier and on the webinar, communication is key. Transparency is key. If you have that requirement, don't surprise them with it at the end of this month. Start preparing them now for that change. Start, you need to have a plan in place, first of all, for what you're going to do if you do have an exposure in your workplace or somebody is sick. So separate from that, you want to communicate what the requirements are to return to work, and you want to have your plan in place, because once everybody starts coming back to work, then you're likely going to have exposures and illness or spread. And because of your responsibility under OSHA and just to keep operating, you want to limit the exposures as best you can. Return to work strategies could also be when we have that exposure, what are we going to require to return somebody back to work? So what you do or what you don't do is very specific to your industry. Are you a critical infrastructure employer? Are you healthcare? Do you serve a population that is high risk? All of those things are specific to you, so you want to come up with what works in your environment, what makes sense in your industry. If you have an employee that is ill, used to be CDC recommended 2 negative tests separated by a 24-hour time frame to be able to return to work. But they've backed off of that return to work strategy, or a great deal, because of the inconsistencies and the unreliability of the testing and the time that it takes. So originally it was, 14-day quarantine, or 10 days since you've been, since the onset of symptoms, or 72 hours fever-free. And all of those things can still apply. People are backing off of the requiring the testing just because it extends the time so much and you need to have your employees there. It doesn't mean that you're not taking the exposure to your employees in the workforce seriously just because you're not going to require that testing. The CDC itself has backed off of that. So that's part of what you want to communicate in your plan. You know, what is my rule going to be? And then explain to the people that are coming back, whether you're working remotely or whether you're coming back to work and you're concerned about an exposure, the other things that you're doing as an employer to keep people safe in the workplace, whether you're requiring masks where people can't social distance, or you're taking added steps to clean the workplace and not share equipment or congregate in the lunchrooms like you did before. Just communicate those, because this is an overall approach. It's a comprehensive approach. So we want to just communicate everything that we're doing, what the requirements are to the employees and what steps you're taking as the employer. You don't want it to be a surprise.
Thanks, Michelle. And what about, so a question has come in, can you clarify? I know at some point there was kind of a requirement where you had to show some tests. Can I still require 2 negative tests to return to work, or is that no longer allowed?
No, it's allowed. The CDC is putting out guidance. So the employer still has the right to decide what they want in their workplace. And there are concerns too. I mean, employers fall under the OSHA General Duty Clause, which says that you have to maintain a safe workplace, safe from known hazards. Well, COVID is a known hazard. This pandemic has just done so much to our environment, but it's also something that we now know is not completely going away. So we have to figure out a way to work with it. They did say at one time that if you got it once, you couldn't get it again, but now they're not even sure that that's true. So, I mean, the CDC is providing guidance. The CDC is not putting out a legal requirement for the employer. So within the scope of the options that you have, those are considered reasonable because an employer is getting that from a reliable source and trying to determine, you know, balance all the needs of the workplace, the other employees, and everything else and decide what's reasonable. So you can still require 2 negative tests, but just be prepared that it may take a long time before somebody tests completely negative. And to get 2 tests, I've heard horror stories of it taking about 2 months. So at that point, you have an employee that's asymptomatic that's not able to return. So you've got to think about, am I going to allow remote work for that position? If so, because if it's 2 months, you know, the people call COVID pay, the FFCRA pay, whether it's under the emergency sick leave part, that's going to be long exhausted if we're out for a month or more. So we've got to look at other things, you know, how's the work going to get done? Can I allow the remote work and things like that? You can still require the 2 tests. You could use, that would be a test-based strategy, return to work. You could use symptoms-based, which already employers should not be letting anybody work when they're ill. Originally, the symptoms were more narrow in their scope, but they've grown as different strains of this virus have come out. So just, you know, making sure people are healthy when they're at work. You can also do a symptom-based, you know, how long has it been since they've had symptoms? 14 days for a quarantine, 10 days since the onset of symptoms, 72 hours. You can also require a doctor's note to be able to return to work. So that's all within an employer's right to require. The CDC doesn't tell you what's required. They're telling you what they recommend and what the guidance is from what they know. And I do think it's important to add, the guidance that I'm giving is largely for private employers. Public employers might fall under different rules dictated by the government. Sure.
So what if an employer has an employee that's refusing to return? What does that look like, and can that employer terminate? You
can, but there's some things that you should do first. So communication, consistent, clear, transparent communication. These are keywords that should be part of any employment scenario. So when somebody is refusing to return to work, if all the communication has been verbal up to now, then before you terminate, I would do a letter. I would consider maybe a two-step on the letter process. So the first step would be, we allowed remote work on a temporary basis, and it's now time for everybody to return to work. This is what we're doing to keep the workplace safe. This is what we're doing to, we have a business need to get back to work, and, we need you back at work by this day. If you have a reason why, let us know in writing what that reason is. So because like return to work, just like any other employment scenario, you have to look at what laws or requirements touch on that subject. So you want to give that employee an opportunity to explain what their concern is. Well, why don't you want to come back to work? Well, I don't want to come back to work because my child needs me, right? They are doing remote learning. Well, that should trigger you falling under your FFCRA process. Let's get some paperwork started. Let's evaluate the reason and see if it applies. So the FFCRA allows for that expanded family medical leave for employees that they can't work or telework because their children, childcare or place of school is closed due to COVID. So now that school has reopened, my kids went back to school today. In our district, we have a choice. We can choose to continue the remote learning, or we can choose to go in person. Where an employee has a choice, the federal government has come out and said in their FFCRA FAQs that if it's the employee's choice and they choose, then the FFCRA protection does not apply. So if an employee gives you that reason as why they're coming back, then you explain to them that because it is your choice, you don't have to honor it. You don't have to allow the time off, and that's their decision to make. So their decision might mean it's costing them their job. But let's say that the school didn't offer an in-person option. Then before you terminate, you have to determine, does their time off fall under the expanded family medical leave part? And it does. For reason number 5 on the poster, it would qualify. So that's for up to a total of 12 weeks that they can get 2/3 of their pay for that reason. But you can have a process that you follow and require reasonable documentation. One, where they attest that there is no other suitable person that could be there while the child is remote learning. You can also get the name and ages of the children and why they need supervision to be at home if they're 15 or older. So there are steps that we want to take to clarify. If the employee said the reason they can't come back is because they've got a family member with a serious health condition that was maybe due to COVID, you have to evaluate whether or not FMLA, regular FMLA, applies. And if it does, then you have to exhaust that. That is unpaid, but you might have to exhaust that if the employee is eligible. So you need to look at that. But if the employee just doesn't want to come back because they're fearful of being in the workplace, or they have grown comfortable and prefer to work at home, that is an employer's right to require employees to come back to work. So once you have in writing what the reason is and you've evaluated that, then communicate to the employee that you still need them to come to work because it doesn't fall under any other legal protection. And then you give them a hard date of when you need them to come to work. And if they refuse, then that second letter would be, you could do an email or a letter, but it would be a follow-up, regarding the conversation we just had. We are going to require you to return to work. We need you back by this day. We have denied your request to continue to work from home. We need you back by this day. If we don't have you back by that time, we will consider that you have chosen to abandon your job, and we will process your separation from the company as your self-termination, job abandonment, or resignation. If they are communicating with you, then that's not job abandonment. But sometimes you have people just never respond anymore, and that would be why you would use job abandonment.
So thank you, Michelle. So can you speak to an organization allowing some positions to work from home and then some positions not? What do you recommend in regards to proper protocol with some being able and allowed and some needing to show up to the office?
Okay, so we have been seeing a lot of lawsuits come up in this COVID era, because there are times when you may need to make a job-specific decision. So by that I mean the outcome may not be the same for all positions. So you might allow one person to work remotely and not somebody else. So to be able to, one, communicate effectively and try to still maintain a positive working environment, and to be able to reduce your risk of discrimination, that you should have a consistent process in which you evaluate a request or the ability to work from home. So again, follow a consistent process. So whether it's an employee's request, I would get their request in writing. What do they want and why? You evaluate what laws apply, and then you evaluate what you can do in that particular job. So if, let's say you have drivers or warehouse employees, they physically can't do their job from home because it requires them to be there. Well, let's say you have a dispatch person who most of the time is on the phone with the drivers. Well, can they effectively do that at home? You've got to dig into the details of what that job requires. If they need to physically be there and check the drivers in and out, and they need to have access to the GPS information, and you have a system and they have, walkie-talkies or a phone set up that can accommodate all of that, then that position is best suited to work in the workplace. But your reason is specific to the job. This job does not lend itself to doing that. It could also, be an administrative job where you maybe assist a manager and it's hard for you to do all aspects of your job remotely. So you're just digging into the details and giving the job-related reasons why. And that communication is important because it shows that you've gone through, that you're being transparent about the reasons why. Just saying no opens the door for there to be hurt feelings, and my perception would be that you don't like me because you're not allowing me to work from home, but you're allowing so-and-so, so you like them better. Well, if I'm of a protected class, a different protected class, it could be that you're really discriminating, and you've got to be able to put yourself in a position as the employer to defend those claims. So you would have a system in place that starts with the request, and you have some documentation. Documentation is always important to show that you evaluated the job and what you could do, and then you provided an answer that was based on some legitimate work-related criteria that was not retaliatory against the employee or discriminatory in any way. So you can have one person working remotely and another one not, but it needs to be specific to the job that they do for you, or maybe their ability to do it. If, like I have 2 computer screens. If I don't have 2 computer screens at home and I'm not as productive, you can make the decision based on that. You can make the decision based on how they've handled the remote work since they've been home, and you're not seeing the volume of work that you need to see from that position. So it, excuse me. So it can be specific to that person's work performance. But again, it needs to be clearly communicated, the reasons why. And it should be fact-based, not I have a feeling they'd be more productive in the office. No, think of it in terms of actual numbers. It might be hard in every job, but let's say a sales position, you require so many calls a day, and right now they're not doing that. After seeing that consistently, you can have them come in, or maybe the sales team working together to discuss how to overcome objections and brainstorm new ideas. Maybe that's something you want to require in the position. Maybe, accounts payable, they can enter in what they need to, but maybe you don't have enough licenses and everybody needs to use the system that you have in the office because it's backed up here, and you've got, a generator with consistent internet, and you can't lose that data. I mean, you're just going to dig into the details of that job.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you speak on the executive orders and what that means for employers?
Sure. So, there were numerous executive orders. The one I'm specifically going to talk about, we've gotten some questions about, was Trump permitted the deferral of withholdings, the Social Security segment of the FICA for employees only, not employers. But we were waiting for the Treasury Department to put out some guidance because employers were scrambling, thinking, how am I going to do this? Does my payroll system have the accountability if I do payroll in-house? How am I going to track that? What's the concern if I don't pay it back? Because it was just a temporary deferral. It wasn't, we're taking the obligation away all total. So you would have to, as an employer, if you allowed it, you would have to track how much you allowed, what they needed to pay back over, when it would start. It was just a huge administrative burden. So we were waiting and waiting to see this Treasury guidance, and it's come out, but it's not clear enough. And so, we're not tax professionals, we're not CPAs, and you have a tax liability as an employer. So a lot of employers and even payroll companies have decided that they're going to opt not to do it because of the burden that it is to the employers, because at some cases, we're talking about maybe a $14 difference in your paycheck. And then trying to track that $14 savings and paying when they have to pay that back or double up when they come back. It was just, like I said, a huge burden. And then there was a great deal of liability for the employer if they did it wrong, if they calculated it wrong, if they didn't collect it properly, if they didn't remit it by the deadline. What happens if an employee leaves and is no longer employed? So most experts in the payroll and the employment side don't see there being enough benefit and it potentially being detrimental. So they have opted not to do it because of the additional liabilities. But if you want more guidance on the details, we would say you need to be reaching out to your CPA, your tax professional, your payroll company, and ask those specific questions on how to do it. Because it was extremely complicated. And even though the intention might have been good, the practical nature of it was just very burdensome, and the liabilities that it created outweighed the benefits that we have seen from this deferral option.
Thank you, Michelle. Moving on, can you speak to the COVID waivers, and do you feel as though they are worth it to put into place?
So I will address COVID waivers on two sides, on the employment side and as the employer that deals with customers. So a waiver for an employee is not really going to be enforceable, and I would not recommend it. So one, you have to think about what message that sends. Earlier, we were talking about returning remote employees back to the workforce. And, fear is a very real thing. I've heard of some parents not sending their kids back to school because of fear. Well, employees have that same fear coming back in the workplace. Think about that concerned employee and then presenting them with a waiver that says, if you get COVID in the workplace, we're not responsible and you can't sue us. So number one, it doesn't really send a very confident message to your employee that you are confident that the workplace is going to be free of known hazards. So there's that. The other thing is an employee can't sign away their rights. So we talked about OSHA general duty clause and the duty employers have to keep their workplace safe. So there is that protection. There's also, you know, I don't know if some of you might have heard of contract tracing, where on the work comp side, where you've got to keep your workplace safe, clean, and consider the risks of COVID in your workforce. But you also need to consider, did an employee get COVID in my workplace, and could it be workman's comp now? So that's a whole nother conversation, but if that was the case, your waiver wouldn't protect you from that either. So an employee can't sign away their rights under OSHA or under workman's comp, or just in general to sue you. Workman's comp is going to offer the employer some protection, a subscriber to workman's comp, because it'll limit the liabilities that you have as an employer, the caps on the amount that you can be exposed to. A non-subscriber has greater liability because you don't have those same caps, but you could still, you know, be sued. So a waiver is not going to take that away. They're largely going to be unenforceable, and then think of the message that it sends to your employees. So, and that goes for most waivers in the workplace. We can talk more about that if you have specific questions. But as far as waivers go, if you serve the public, I think they would be something that employers should think about to try and limit those liabilities. So for example, if you are a cable provider, an HVAC technician, and you've got to go into a customer's home, having that customer sign a waiver as well as a health questionnaire would be something that you would consider. And then the customer can make that choice. I mean, think about if you are a gym and you're reopening. You know, you're going to do the things, and you would also communicate to your customers the things you're doing to keep them safe. But a waiver for a customer, just like, you know, a waiver to use the equipment, that I'm not going to sue you if I injure myself by using your gym equipment, the same type of waiver on the COVID, for COVID related reasons, would work on the customer environment. You're also seeing some of it in the school systems, some in private schools, things like that. And it's just, you know, trying to reduce that liability. You're talking about gross negligence in most cases. It goes under contract law, but if you're grossly negligent because you haven't taken the normal precautions that maybe the CDC recommends, then maybe you could still be sued with, even though you have a waiver, but it could be a deterrent and it could be enforceable minus the gross negligence side of it.
Thank you for your guidance, Michelle. I do want to remind everyone, when you do go and sign up for these sessions each month, you can go ahead and submit questions ahead of time. So that's an opportunity as well. And I can get those questions over to Michelle, and she can be ready to address those with the group. So moving along, I'm going to address one of the questions I did receive from an employer. Can we legally fire an employee who's showing up late, not answering phone calls, and sometimes not showing up at all for the small amount of work that we have during this time? This employee has been being paid full-time since the shutdown started.
Yes, 100% yes. The way you go about it, I would point to policy. I would, of course, hold everybody accountable. If you've been paying somebody the whole time, I mean, that we might want to dissect that a little bit. You don't have an obligation to pay somebody for not working. I know some companies, some employers got PPP loans, and so they had to pay that portion back as payroll and be able to show that. And that's fine, but you would want to set up the expectations clearly. You know, I can pay you this portion. I need you to track your time. I need you to do this. When, if I pay you while you're out, it comes with the stipulation that when I do call you to come in, you show up on time, and all of our other company policies apply. So, and that's something that a lot of employers are struggling with. You know, employees are forgetting the things like being prompt, or good attendance, or, you know, communicating when they can't work on a certain day. Just because you're working remotely doesn't mean the company policies don't apply anymore. So we're going to remind them of that in that communication. We're also going to look at, if this has been happening this whole time, what have we done to hold them accountable during while they've been doing this? Have we given them any warning? Have we given them any indication that they're about to be terminated? Because as an employer, if you've accepted them showing up late or them not coming in for a small amount of work, then you've kind of trained them to believe it's okay to do that. So if that's been the case, then you need to stop and start holding them accountable now. So communicating with them. I would get some documentation in order to, you know, we've been very flexible with you for the last month. You have refused to do this, this, and this, and it's unacceptable. Now I'm going to give you a final warning. Now, normally it's progressive in nature. You know, you get, I'm sure there's been some verbal communications at the very least, if they've done that, but there may not be anything in writing. It would be in your best interest to have some warning in writing before you terminate. You know, we are an employment at will state, and we get this question a lot, you know, can we terminate them? If we can terminate at any time for any reason, why can't I terminate for a good reason? Well, you can, but being in an employment at will state and being able to terminate for that reason doesn't mean you don't have other risks associated with that employment action. So a risk might be to your organization. It might be unemployment's a real risk. Unemployment's a fault-based system, and you're not going to win that claim if you can't show that you told the employee what the rule was, that they violated the rule, that you told them what would happen if they continued to violate it, and then they did, and then you terminated. That is the way that you prove misconduct. When you don't have that, it's nothing in writing. It's really as if it almost didn't happen. It's technically your word against the employee's word. And you as the employer have the burden of proving that you did what you said you did. So that's where your documentation comes in handy. Doesn't also mean that the employee can't sue you or say that you violated their rights for some other reason. So while you can terminate, how you terminate matters, and the documentation you have on file and the communication with the employee. Most employees can understand when you tell them what the expectation is and that they're not meeting it. Most employees will be reasonable and will understand or ask for a second chance or step up. So you want to warn them. If you haven't warned them already, I would at least give them a final warning before you let them go. But yes, you can let them go for that reason. And you can be holding them accountable to anything when you're, you know, to anything reasonable work-related wise while you're paying them.
Thank you, Michelle. So I haven't received any other questions via the chat box. I'm going to give everyone an opportunity. If they do have a question and would like to personally ask Michelle, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your questions. Otherwise, that's all we have for this month. Please go ahead and save the date for October, Tuesday, October 13th. These take place the second Tuesday of every month, and we would love to have you join us in October. So feel free, if you do have a question, to go ahead and unmute your computer and ask Michelle.
And I would also like to say, if you guys are seeing trends or you have a hot topic that you would like to see addressed, shoot Elizabeth or myself or Tamara an email. We would like to provide content that's relevant to you. And so what I'm looking at calls and emails that we get to develop this content, but we'd be happy to address something that's important in your environment. One question that's come up as people are working remotely is, how do I track my work time? So there are all kinds of apps that employees can clock in and clock out. They can log in on any computer to track their work time. And this would be for a non-exempt staff member. But also remember, you have the duty as the employer to have accurate record keeping and to pay appropriately. So while working remotely, I would recommend that employees confirm their work hours when you get ready to submit payroll. Also, for non-exempt, for exempt staff members, you can still have them account for their time because they're being paid. And they could be using PTO, or they could be actually having their pay docked if they miss full days or full weeks of work. Even if they are exempt, if they have exhausted all of their paid time off and they miss days for personal reasons. So record keeping is still important as we work remotely. Gotten that question a lot.
Thank you, Michelle.
Sure.
With no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Let me see. One did just come in. Oh, someone is just commenting that they have decided to pay an employee, or they have decided to pay employees that are exposed to COVID, even if not at work.
Okay, so the FFCRA, the Families First Corona Response Act, has reasons that you are obligated to pay for when it's COVID related. So if an employee is ill and experiencing COVID related symptoms and seeking a diagnosis, that would fall under the FFCRA. So they would be entitled to 80 hours at 100% of their pay for those 2 weeks. But if an employer decides to do more than that, that is fine. That's the minimum requirement that's set out by law, but you can do more. And it's helpful to do more, but I would have a system in place so that you can ensure that you're consistently doing it for all employees. So we're not picking and choosing who we do it to, because that's when we open ourselves up for additional liabilities. Also, if you are setting a little bit of a precedent. So getting some documentation in place, what would the criteria be in which you would do that? So once somebody has exhausted their COVID pay and they're still not able to return, then I would go ahead and document the reasons why. So if you're going to allow 2 more weeks, tell them I'll allow 2 more weeks. But I have heard of some some clients call in with it being hard because they've set that expectation and they don't know how to change it. So my recommendation would be communicate often and set up smaller timeframes to be able to revisit what you've decided to do and put some requirements on it. But yes, it's perfectly legal for you to pay employees. Just remember that how you do it may create some complications in getting people to return to work and not take advantage. And it may also set you up for some concerns for liability. So we want to be sure we have a consistent documented process in place.
Perfect. Thank y'all so much. Y'all have a great day.
Okay. Bye.